A millionaire builds a church to challenge faith, but a little girl's words bring him to his knees. A bitter wind swept through Millbrook's quiet streets as the headlines blazed across the morning paper's Millionaire to build city's grandest church, but not for prayer. The news spread like wildfire through the small town, where faith had always been as natural as breathing. Michael Harrison stood at the construction site, his expensive coat fluttering in the cold November air. His steel-gray eyes reflected the setting sun as he addressed the gathering crowd of reporters. "I'll build the most magnificent church this town has ever seen. Not because I believe, but to prove that faith is nothing more than an illusion. Everything in this world, every miracle, every blessing, can be bought with money and power." His words hung heavy in the air, challenging decades of tradition and belief. Little did he know that his declaration of defiance would set in motion events that would shake not just his own convictions, but the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about faith, truth, and redemption. This opening sets up the central conflict immediately, introduces our antagonist turned protagonist Michael Harrison, and establishes both the physical setting Millbrook and the thematic terrain faith vs. materialism of our story. The bitter wind and setting sun provide atmospheric elements that mirror the spiritual winter in Michael's heart, while the gathered crowd represents the community whose faith he's challenging. There's immediate tension in his provocative statement, hooking readers with the question of what could drive someone to such a dramatic gesture of defiance against faith. A moment of your time, please let us know where you're watching from and hit the like button. Your engagement helps us create better content for our community worldwide. Michael Harrison wasn't always the titan of industry whose name now graced the skyline of Millbrook. 20 years ago, he was just another hopeful soul, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses to put food on their table. Every night, despite their poverty, his mother would kneel beside his bed, her calloused hands clasped in prayer, whispering words of gratitude and hope for her only son's future. Those prayers seemed to work, at least for a while. Through scholarships and countless late-night jobs, Michael graduated top of his class from business school. His mother didn't live to see that day cancer took her during his final semester, leaving him alone with nothing but her worn Bible and an unshakable determination to prove that hard work, not divine intervention, determined one's fate. His rise in the business world was meteoric. Starting as a junior analyst, Michael displayed an almost supernatural ability to spot opportunities others missed. By 30, he had founded Harrison Investments, turning distressed properties into gold mines. His reputation for brutal efficiency and ruthless decision-making became legendary in corporate circles. But it was the betrayal that transformed him from merely successful to bitter. 5 years ago, the Blessed Hope Foundation, a religious charitable organization, approached him with what seemed like a divine opportunity, a chance to honor his mother's memory by helping underprivileged children. Michael donated millions, his first act of faith since his mother's death. The foundation was a sophisticated fraud. The money disappeared, along with the dreams of hundreds of families who had pinned their hopes on promised scholarships and medical treatments. When the dust settled, Michael found himself not just robbed of his money that he could recover, but of something far more precious, his last connection to his mother's faith. Now at 45, Michael Harrison cut an imposing figure. His tailored suits and perfectly groomed silver-streaked hair projected power and control. His office on the top floor of Harrison Tower offered a commanding view of Millbrook, but his eyes always seemed drawn to the spires of the old churches dotting the landscape. Those who worked closely with him noticed how his expression hardened whenever he glimpsed them, as if each steeple was a personal affront. His public persona was carefully crafted, the self-made man who conquered poverty through sheer will and intelligence. In interviews, he emphasized rationality and dismissed what he called fairy tales of divine intervention. His charitable giving was strictly secular scholarships based on merit, medical research with measurable outcomes, urban development projects with clear returns on investment. But late at night, when the office emptied and the city slept, something different emerged. Security cameras occasionally caught him standing at his office window, holding his mother's old Bible, though he never opened it. The cleaning staff sometimes found fresh roses on his desk, his mother's favorite flower, though he always denied ordering them. This was the man who now stood ready to build the grandest church in Millbrook, not as an act of faith, but as its ultimate challenge. In his mind, it would stand as a monument to human achievement, proof that even the most sacred spaces could be bought and sold. What he couldn't admit, even to himself, was that every brick would also be a question to the God he claimed not to believe in. Why did you take her? Why didn't you protect us from fraud? Why should anyone believe? The announcement of the church project sent ripples through the business community. Some praised it as a masterful PR move. Others privately wondered if the unshakable Michael Harrison had finally lost his edge. But none of them knew the full story: the lonely nights, the unanswered prayers, the deep well of pain that drove him to this grand gesture of defiance. None of them could guess that this project, intended as his ultimate triumph over faith, would instead become the cornerstone of his own unexpected redemption. Millbrook wasn't always the bustling small city it is today. Nestled in the heart of Massachusetts, the town grew from humble beginnings around its historic churches and the old textile mills that once drove its economy. When the mills closed in the 1980s, most expected Millbrook to fade into obscurity like so many other New England factory towns. But something different happened here. The community pulled together, reinventing itself through a combination of small businesses, technology startups, and ironically faith-based initiatives. At the heart of this transformation stood the St. Thomas Charity Center, housed in a century-old brick building on Cedar Street. Founded by Father Thomas Williams 40 years ago, the center began as a simple soup kitchen but grew into something much more. Its weathered facade and worn wooden doors concealed a hub of hope where thousands found not just meals but medical care, job training, and a path to dignity. The center occupied a unique place in Millbrook's geography and heart. Situated between the affluent East Side, with its restored Victorian mansions, and the struggling West Side's modest homes, it served as a bridge between two worlds. Local business leaders would serve meals alongside former recipients of the center's help, creating connections that transcended social boundaries. Even Michael Harrison's mother had volunteered there, though her son seemed to have forgotten this detail. The community that gathered around the center reflected Millbrook's diversity. Recent immigrants worked alongside descendants of the original mill workers. Retired executives taught computer skills to young single mothers. Muslim volunteers worked the Christmas dinner shift so their Christian counterparts could attend services. It was a living testament to what Father Thomas always preached: faith without works is dead. But beneath this picture of harmony, trouble brewed. The Blessed Hope Foundation's fraud had shaken more than just Michael Harrison's faith. The scandal touched many in Millbrook who had donated to their cause. The foundation's leaders had been clever, using local connections and religious language to win trust. They had even attempted to partner with the St. Thomas Center, though Father Thomas's caution had protected his organization from direct involvement. The physical landscape of Millbrook told its own story of change. Harrison Tower, Michael's gleaming headquarters, cast its shadow over the historic town square. New construction increasingly encroached on older neighborhoods. Property values soared, pushing longtime residents to the margins. The real estate boom brought prosperity but also tension, as developers eyed every historic property as a potential goldmine. The plot where Michael planned his church held special significance. Adjacent to the St. Thomas Center, it had once been home to Millbrook's first hospital, founded by nuns in 1890. The original building burned down decades ago, but the land remained in trust for charitable purposes until a series of legal maneuvers transferred ownership to Harrison Investments. Throughout Millbrook, ancient churches stood like sentinels of tradition: St. Mary's with its Gothic spires, the simple dignity of the First Baptist Church, the modern lines of Hope Community Chapel. Each spoke to a different era of faith, a different expression of belief. Michael's planned church would dwarf them all, its proposed design more resembling a corporate headquarters than a house of worship. Weather in Millbrook tended toward dramatic extremes: brutal winters, glorious springs, humid summers, and spectacular autumns. Locals said you could measure a person's character by how they handled the seasons. The old-timers still talked about the blizzard of '78, when the St. Thomas Center stayed open for 2 weeks straight, housing stranded travelers and providing emergency shelter. Every crisis seemed to bring out both the best and worst in the community, revealing the true hearts of its people. This was the stage upon which Michael Harrison's challenge to faith would play out: a town steeped in tradition yet racing toward modernity, a community united by faith yet divided by economics, a place where old grudges and new hopes intertwined like the vines on the St. Thomas Center's walls. The press conference announcing the church project was held on a crisp October morning in Harrison Tower's marble-floored atrium. Local media jostled with national news crews drawn by the provocative nature of Michael Harrison's announcement. The irony of a self-proclaimed atheist building a $100 million church was too compelling to ignore. Standing at the polished podium, Michael cut an imposing figure in his charcoal Armani suit. "Today I'm announcing the construction of what will be the largest and most technologically advanced church in New England." He began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "But let me be clear, this isn't an act of faith. This is a demonstration that anything, even the sacred, can be achieved through human effort and capital alone." The assembled press corrupted with questions. Michael fielded them with practiced ease, outlining plans for a structure that would combine traditional religious architecture with modern amenities. "We'll have seating for 3,000, a state-of-the-art audio system, and the largest pipe organ on the East Coast," he explained. "Everything that any other church has, but better, and we'll do it without a single prayer." Father Thomas Williams sat quietly in the back row, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he listened. At 72, he had served Millbrook for over 4 decades, but never had he faced a challenge quite like this. When a reporter finally noticed his presence and asked for comment, he stood slowly, leaning on his worn wooden cane. "Mr. Harrison has every right to build what he wishes," Father Thomas said, his gentle voice carrying surprising strength. "But a church isn't just stone and glass. It's the faith of the people within it. You can't buy that, Mr. Harrison, no matter how much money you spend." Their eyes met across the room, youth and age, power and humility, defiance and wisdom in a moment that would be replayed on news channels for days to come. The story exploded across social media. Harrison's challenge began trending nationally. Religious leaders debated his actions on morning shows. Atheist groups praised his bold stance against religious privilege, while faith leaders condemned what they saw as a mockery of sacred spaces. Architectural magazines praised the innovative design, while religious publications questioned the ethics of the project. In Millbrook, the announcement sparked fierce debates. The Chamber of Commerce welcomed the investment and potential tourism draw. Local contractors competed for lucrative construction contracts. But in diners and coffee shops, at Little League games and PTA meetings, the town divided along unexpected lines. Some lifelong churchgoers supported the project for its potential economic benefits, while secular residents questioned the wisdom of antagonizing the religious community. The letters flooded the Millbrook Gazette. "Who does Harrison think he is?" wrote one resident. "Money doesn't give him the right to mock our faith," another countered. "If he wants to spend his millions proving a point, let him. Maybe we'll all learn something." The paper's editorial board attempted neutrality but couldn't resist noting the paradox of an atheist becoming the town's largest religious builder. Michael watched the controversy unfold from his penthouse office, a thin smile playing at his lips. Every objection, every debate, every angry letter only fueled his determination. He had anticipated resistance, even welcomed it. What he hadn't expected was the quiet way Father Thomas's words had lodged in his mind, echoing in the late hours when he reviewed the project plans. The final permit hearing at City Hall drew hundreds. Michael's team of lawyers and architects presented detailed plans, emphasizing the economic benefits and architectural significance. But when Father Thomas rose to speak, the room fell silent. "I don't oppose this project," the old priest said, surprising everyone. "But I pray that in building this church, Mr. Harrison finds what he's really looking for." The comment infuriated Michael, though he couldn't explain why. As October turned to November, construction fences went up around the site. The sign proclaimed "Future Home of the Harrison Memorial Church" in bold letters, with a digital countdown to the scheduled opening. Few noticed that Michael had unconsciously chosen his mother's birthday for the dedication ceremony, a detail that would later seem heavy with significance. The demolition of the old St. Thomas Charity Center's auxiliary building began on a gray December morning. The rumble of heavy machinery drowned out the quiet prayers of a small group gathered across the street, led by Father Thomas. As the first wall came down, dust clouded the air, carrying with it memories of decades of service to Millbrook's neediest residents. Michael Harrison supervised the demolition personally, standing apart from his construction team in his immaculate overcoat. He watched as Father Thomas dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief, dismissing the old priest's emotion as mere sentimentality. Yet something made him pause when a faded sign emerged from the rubble. "Hope lives here," painted in his mother's distinctive handwriting, a remnant from her volunteering days he hadn't known existed. The construction timeline was aggressive, even by Harrison's standards. 3 shifts of workers labored around the clock, their floodlights turning night into day. Local residents complained about the noise and disruption, but Harrison's lawyers had secured all necessary permits. The project seemed unstoppable until Father Thomas came forward with troubling allegations. At a charged city council meeting, the elderly priest presented documents suggesting irregularities in the land acquisition. This property was deeded in perpetuity for charitable purposes, he explained, his voice steady despite his obvious fatigue. Its transfer to Harrison Investments involved manipulation of records and pressure on vulnerable board members. The accusations made headlines, but Harrison's legal team quickly moved to discredit them. Anonymous sources began feeding local media stories about Father Thomas's supposed mismanagement of charity funds. The Millbrook Gazette, recently acquired by a business partner of Harrison's, ran a front page expose questioning the priest's financial dealings. Though the allegations were thinly sourced, the damage to Father Thomas's reputation was immediate and severe. Meanwhile, the construction site transformed daily. Steel beams reached skyward, forming the skeleton of what would indeed be the largest church in New England. The design blended Gothic Revival architecture with modern elements, soaring spires of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. Even critics admitted its striking beauty, though some questioned whether a structure built on spike could ever truly inspire devotion. The human cost of the project became increasingly visible. The displacement of the Charity Center's services affected hundreds of Millbrook's poorest residents. Homeless individuals who had relied on the center's shelter program now huddled in doorways within sight of the rising church. Harrison avoided their eyes when his driver brought him to inspect the construction progress. One particularly cold morning, Harrison arrived to find someone had scaled the fence overnight and painted a single word across the construction sign. Why the security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned, but Harrison recognized the handwriting. It matched that of the "Hope Lives Here" sign from the demolition. His mother's style, but impossible, she was long gone. The incident unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Support for Father Thomas grew despite the media attacks. Former recipients of the center's help came forward with stories of how he had changed their lives. A local lawyer offered to represent him pro bono in challenging the land transfer. But the priest declined to pursue legal action, saying only, "This battle won't be won in court." As winter deepened, rumors began circulating about the real estate corporation backing Harrison's project. Whispers of similar land grabs in other cities, always targeting religious or charitable properties, always following the same pattern of discrediting local opposition. Father Thomas received anonymous threats warning him to stay quiet, which he reported to police but refused to let deter him. The construction continued relentlessly, but small inexplicable problems began to plague the site. Tools disappeared, materials arrived incorrect, workers reported strange feelings and refused night shifts. Harrison dismissed such concerns as superstition, yet found himself increasingly drawn to visit the site at odd hours, standing in the massive skeleton of his church, feeling something he couldn't name tugging at his carefully constructed walls of certainty. If you're finding this story meaningful, a simple like would mean a lot. It helps other readers discover this tale of faith, redemption, and the power of unexpected connections. The morning of the church's dedication dawned cold and threatening. Dark clouds hung low over Millbrook, bringing unseasonable rain that fell in heavy sheets. Michael Harrison stood at his penthouse window watching lightning flash across the sky, illuminating the gleaming spires of his creation. Weather forecasts had promised sunshine. This storm felt like a personal affront. Despite the downpour, crowds began gathering hours before the scheduled ceremony. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like modern prayers. The international media had seized on the story's irresistible narrative, the atheist millionaire's temple of defiance. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, delivering live updates to viewers worldwide about Harrison's challenge as it had come to be known. Behind the church's massive bronze doors, Harrison inspected every detail one final time. The interior was a masterpiece of design: soaring ceilings, hand-carved pews, stained glass windows that would paint the floors with rainbow light if the sun ever emerged. The pipe organ, largest in New England, waited silently for its debut. Everything was perfect, exactly as he'd demanded. Yet standing alone in the vast space, Harrison felt an unexpected hollow sensation in his chest. Outside, another kind of crowd had gathered. Dozens of former Charity Center residents stood in the rain, holding silent vigil. Many wore signs around their necks displaying simple messages. The center gave me hope. Father Thomas saved my life. Where do we go now? Security kept them behind barriers, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Among them, though Harrison didn't yet know it, stood Sarah Thompson, the 8-year-old girl whose words would soon shake his carefully constructed world. The ceremony was scheduled for noon, but at 11:30 an unexpected development threatened to derail everything. Father Thomas arrived, leaning heavily on his cane, accompanied by a group of local religious leaders. Despite attempts to keep him off the guest list, someone had sent him an invitation. Harrison watched from a window as security debated whether to admit them. The camera swiveled, sensing drama. Finally, Harrison himself made the decision: let them in. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of playing victim. As the doors opened to admit the general public, the rain intensified. The carefully planned procession became a chaotic rush as guests hurried inside, designer clothes and elaborate hats dripping on the imported marble floors. The pews filled quickly: civic leaders, business associates, media figures, and curious onlookers. Harrison had deliberately not invited any clergy to officiate, planning to conduct the ceremony himself. Standing at the podium, Harrison cut an imposing figure in his perfectly tailored black suit. The interior lights caught the silver in his hair, creating what photographers would later call a mockery of a halo. He tapped the microphone, and the murmur of conversation died away. Outside, thunder rolled as if nature itself was demanding to be part of the proceedings. "Welcome," Harrison began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Today we celebrate not just the opening of a building, but the triumph of human achievement over superstition. This church, the largest, most expensive, most technically advanced in New England, stands as proof that anything your faith can do, human will and wealth can do better." The words fell into a strange silence. Even those who supported Harrison seemed uncomfortable with the nakedness of his challenge. In the front row, Father Thomas sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. The rain drummed against the windows, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that not even the perfect lighting could dispel. "I stand here today," Harrison continued, warming to his theme, "to issue a challenge. If there is a God, let him show himself. If faith has power, let it prove itself. I've created the perfect stage now. Let's see if anyone appears to use it." He paused for effect, expecting murmurs of protest or support. Instead, the silence deepened. Then, from the back of the church, came the clear voice of a child. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrison, but I think you're looking for God in the wrong place." All heads turned toward the sound. Walking down the center aisle was a small girl, no more than 8 years old, her dark hair dripping from the rain, her second-hand dress soaked through. Security personnel moved to intercept her, but something in her steady gaze made them hesitate. Sarah Thompson continued walking, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floor, leaving small puddles in her wake. Harrison stared at the child, momentarily thrown off script. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face, though he couldn't place it. "And who might you be?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure, his voice caught between amusement and annoyance. The camera swiveled to capture this unexpected development, live feeds broadcasting the moment across the globe. "I'm Sarah," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "I used to sleep in the building you tore down with my daddy. After Mommy died, she reached the front of the church now, standing before the podium, her small frame somehow diminishing Harrison's imposing presence. Father Thomas helped us when nobody else would." A murmur ran through the crowd. Harrison glanced at Father Thomas, noticing for the first time how the old priest was watching the girl with a mixture of concern and what looked like pride. "Well, Sarah?" Harrison said, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is a much better building than the old one, isn't it? More beautiful, more expensive." "But God's not in the buildings, Mr. Harrison," Sarah interrupted, with the simple conviction only a child could muster. "He's in here." She placed her hand over her heart. "That's what Father Thomas taught us, and he was in the old building too, and the way people helped each other and the way they loved each other even when they had nothing else." The rain seemed to drum harder against the windows, but inside the church, an absolute silence had fallen. Even the reporters stood motionless, cameras whirring quietly, capturing every word. Harrison found himself unable to look away from the child's steady gaze eyes that somehow reminded him of his mother's. When Daddy got sick and couldn't work, Sarah continued, it wasn't a fancy building that helped us. It was people who believed in God's love. They shared their food, their clothes, their time. That's where God was, Mr. Harrison. In their hearts, just like he was in your mother's heart when she volunteered at the center. Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. How could this child know about his mother? Behind her, Father Thomas had risen to his feet, concern etched on his features. The old priest seemed to be trying to tell him something with his eyes, something important, but Harrison couldn't process it yet. You built this beautiful church, Sarah said, gesturing at the soaring ceiling, the pristine windows, the gleaming surfaces, but you forgot to put love in it. That's why it feels empty, isn't it? That's why you're still angry and sad, even though you built the biggest church in town. Thunder crashed outside, and several of the stained glass windows rattled in their frames. A single shaft of sunlight suddenly broke through the clouds, sending rainbow colors dancing across the floor between Harrison and Sarah. The timing was so perfect it seemed orchestrated, though by whom no one could say. Your mother understood, Sarah said softly, her voice somehow carrying to every corner of the vast space. She used to tell my daddy that real faith isn't about big buildings or fancy words, it's about loving people the way God loves us, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when we don't understand why things happen the way they do. Harrison gripped the podium, his knuckles white. The child's words were striking chords he'd thought long silenced, awakening memories he'd buried beneath years of cynicism and pain. And still there was that nagging familiarity about her face, something that tugged at the edges of his consciousness, demanding recognition. The aftermath of Sarah's unexpected appearance at the church dedication unfolded like ripples in a still pond. Harrison abruptly ended the ceremony, citing weather concerns, but everyone knew it was the little girl's words that had shaken him. As guests filed out into the now gentle rain, the media buzz was deafening. Video clips of Sarah's speech went viral, with millions of views within hours. Harrison's challenge was quickly replaced by Sarah's message as the trending topic. Back in his penthouse that evening, Harrison paced restlessly, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. The child's words about his mother had struck too close to home. How could she have known those details? He'd kept his mother's volunteer work at the center strictly private, yet Sarah had spoken of it with intimate knowledge. His carefully constructed wall of cynicism had developed its first crack. The morning papers painted contrasting pictures. The Millbrook Gazette, conscious of its ownership, attempted to minimize the incident as a publicity stunt. Other outlets ran with headlines like Child's Faith Challenges Millionaire's Monument and Modern David Meets Corporate Goliath. Religious publications seized upon the story as a modern-day parable, while social media erupted with debates about faith, wealth, and authenticity. Father Thomas received a flood of interview requests, all of which he politely declined. Instead, he was seen going about his usual routine, serving at the temporary soup kitchen, visiting the sick, counseling troubled souls. But those who knew him well noticed how he watched Harrison Tower with a mixture of concern and hope, as if waiting for something. Harrison's business partners were divided. Some urged him to spin the incident into positive publicity, suggesting charitable initiatives to counter any negative impressions. Others advised taking a harder line, investigating the girl and her family for potential connections to religious organizations. Harrison listened to their advice with uncharacteristic silence, his mind repeatedly returning to the way Sarah's eyes had seemed to see right through him. In the days that followed, Harrison found himself unable to enter his magnificent church. He sent others to oversee the final details, claiming pressing business elsewhere. But late at night, his car would be seen parked across the street, his silhouette visible through the tinted windows, watching the moonlight play on the spires he had built as a challenge to faith. The impact on Millbrook's community was profound. People began sharing stories about the old charity center, about Harrison's mother, about small acts of kindness that had changed lives. Longtime residents remembered Ellen Harrison, not as the mother of a millionaire, but as a gentle soul who would stay late after her cleaning shifts to sit with lonely elderly clients, who would share her meager lunch with hungry children, who would pray with anyone who asked, regardless of their faith. Sarah's words about love being absent from the new church sparked intense discussions about the nature of faith and community. Local churches reported increased attendance, not from religious fervor, but from people seeking to understand what the little girl had meant about God being present in acts of love and service. Harrison's investigation into Sarah's background revealed nothing suspicious, but instead uncovered uncomfortable parallels. Her father, James Thompson, had once been a successful small business owner, his company destroyed by the same fraudulent religious organization that had betrayed Harrison. The difference was in their responses. While Harrison had turned to bitterness, Thompson had found support and redemption through the Charity Center's community. The media continued to dig, eventually uncovering records showing that Ellen Harrison and James Thompson had known each other through the center. Thompson had been one of many who attended her funeral, though her son had been too consumed by grief and anger to notice. Photos surfaced of Ellen sitting with a pregnant woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah, her mother, who had died in childbirth years later. As these connections came to light, Harrison's staff noticed subtle changes in their boss. The cutting remarks about faith became less frequent. Photos of his mother appeared on his desk for the first time in years. He began asking questions about the Charity Center's programs under the guise of business research. Those who knew him best sensed an internal struggle between the hardened cynic he had become and something else, something that Sarah's words had awakened. 1 month after the dedication, Harrison received an unmarked envelope containing a worn notebook. Inside, he found his mother's handwriting, diary entries from her time at the center. The final entry, dated just days before her death, read, "My greatest fear is not dying, but that Michael will let his pain turn him away from love. Money can build churches, but only love can make them holy. I pray someday he'll understand that faith isn't about buildings or rules, it's about opening your heart to God's love and sharing it with others." The notebook's appearance remained a mystery, though security cameras showed Father Thomas's distinctive figure leaving the building's mailroom. Harrison spent a sleepless night reading and rereading his mother's words, each passage peeling away layers of protective cynicism he had built over the years. The truth about Sarah Thompson emerged gradually, like a photograph slowly developing in darkroom chemicals. Father Thomas had known all along, of course, but had waited patiently for the right moment to reveal the connections that bound the lives of Sarah Harrison and the Charity Center together in an intricate web of faith, loss, and redemption. 25 years ago, when Ellen Harrison worked as a cleaning lady, one of her regular clients was Rachel Anderson, a young lawyer struggling with a terminal illness. Their friendship transcended employer and employee. They shared lunches, prayers, and hopes for their children's futures. Rachel was newly married to James Thompson, and Ellen would often speak of her own son, Michael, hoping the two families might someday connect through their children. Through his investigation, Harrison discovered photographs of his mother and Rachel together at the Charity Center, their faces bright with laughter despite their circumstances. Rachel had been 6 months pregnant when Ellen died of cancer. In her grief, she had thrown herself into continuing Ellen's volunteer work at the center, even as her own health declined. Sarah was born 2 months premature, and Rachel lived just long enough to name her daughter before passing away. Father Thomas had watched over both families through their losses. He remembered clearly the day Ellen Harrison had come to him, worried about her son's growing bitterness toward faith. "Michael has such a capacity for love," she had told him, "but he's building walls around his heart. Promise me you'll watch over him." Even if he pushes everyone away, the priest had kept that promise through decades of Harrison's public denouncements of religion. The connection between Harrison and the Thompson family ran deeper still. Before the Blessed Hope Foundation scandal, James Thompson's small construction company had been one of Harrison Investments' contractors. When the fraudulent organization destroyed both men's trust in religious institutions, their paths diverged dramatically. Harrison had turned his pain into empire building, while Thompson, left homeless with a young daughter, had found healing through the very faith he might have rejected. The Charity Center itself held more secrets than its simple facade suggested. Original documents revealed that the land had been donated by Harrison's maternal grandfather, with a covenant requiring it to be used for charitable purposes in perpetuity. The legal maneuvers that had transferred the property to Harrison Investments had violated not just the law, but his own family's legacy of generosity. As Harrison delved deeper, he discovered that the real estate corporation backing his project, Pinnacle Development, had a disturbing pattern. They targeted properties with charitable or religious covenants, using a network of shell companies and manufactured controversies to acquire them at fractions of their value. The evidence suggested they had orchestrated the Blessed Hope Foundation scandal, using it to destroy both Harrison's and Thompson's faith while profiting from their pain. Sarah's presence at the church dedication hadn't been coincidental. Father Thomas had ensured she would be there, knowing that her inherent wisdom, so like her mother's, so like Ellen Harrison's, might reach Michael in a way that no adult's words could. The priest had recognized in Sarah the same spirit of unconditional love that had marked both Rachel and Ellen, a living bridge between past and present. The old charity center's significance extended beyond its services. It had been a place where the wealthy and poor of Millbrook met as equals, where Harrison's mother had taught him his first lessons about compassion, and where Sarah had learned the same values from a community carrying on Ellen's legacy. The building Harrison had demolished had contained decades of stories, witnesses to countless acts of kindness and transformation. Most startling was the discovery that Father Thomas had been more than just the center's administrator. He had been Ellen Harrison's spiritual advisor in her final days. Among his personal papers was a letter from Ellen to be given to Michael when he is ready to hear it. The priest had watched and waited for 20 years, through Harrison's rise to wealth and his public rejection of faith, holding this last message from a mother to her son. The intricate connections between all these lives seemed too perfect to be coincidental, yet too complex to have been orchestrated by any human plan. As Harrison pieced together the puzzle, he began to understand what Sarah had meant about God being present in acts of love. Every person involved, his mother, Rachel, James Thompson, Father Thomas, and now Sarah, had faced profound loss, yet chosen to respond with love rather than bitterness. The revelation of these hidden connections would soon force Harrison to confront not just his past actions, but the very foundations of his carefully constructed worldview. The church he had built as a monument to human achievement was about to become the stage for a very different kind of demonstration, one that would shake Millbrook to its core and challenge everything he thought he knew about faith, love, and redemption. The confrontation that would change everything began on a snowy December evening 6 weeks after the church dedication. Harrison sat in his darkened office, surrounded by documents that traced the web of deception behind Pinnacle Development's activities. His computer screens displayed emails, bank transfers, and court records, evidence that would destroy careers and fortunes, including possibly his own. The discovery that Pinnacle had orchestrated the Blessed Hope Foundation scandal hit him like a physical blow. They had deliberately targeted him and James Thompson, knowing their public downfalls would make other property acquisitions easier. His own pain and bitterness had been weaponized, used to help destroy other charitable institutions. The magnitude of the manipulation left him feeling hollow and used. When Father Thomas requested an urgent meeting, Harrison almost refused, but the weight of his mother's diary, still sitting on his desk, compelled him to agree. The elderly priest arrived as snow began falling, bringing with him a thick folder and James Thompson. Harrison's security team hovered uncertainly until he waved them away, leaving the three men alone in his office overlooking the illuminated church spires below. "You've discovered some of it," Father Thomas began, his voice gentle but firm. "But there's more you need to know." The priest laid out evidence showing how Pinnacle Development had systematically targeted religious and charitable properties across the country. They would find vulnerable institutions, create scandals, then swoop in to save the properties through front companies. The pattern was elegant in its evil simplicity. James Thompson spoke next, his voice rough with emotion. "They didn't just steal our money and our faith," he said. "They stole our stories, our connections to each other." He described how Pinnacle's agents had manipulated both men's grief and anger, ensuring they never discovered their shared connection through Ellen Harrison and Rachel Thompson. As they talked, pieces fell into place. The fraudulent foundation had been just one part of a larger scheme. Harrison's own success in turning the scandal into fuel for his anti-religious crusade had made him valuable to Pinnacle. They had quietly backed his rise, steering him toward properties they wanted, using his reputation and resources to further their goals. The evidence was damning. Emails showed Pinnacle executives laughing about using the angry atheist as their unwitting frontman. Financial records revealed how they had profited from each acquisition hidden behind layers of shell companies. Most devastating was proof that they had deliberately delayed Ellen Harrison's insurance payments during her illness, adding to her son's bitterness toward institutional religion. Harrison's hands shook as he read documents showing how thoroughly he'd been played. His grand gesture of building the church meant to be his statement of defiance against faith had actually been subtly encouraged by Pinnacle. They had planned to use it as precedent for converting other religious properties to commercial use. "Why show me this now?" Harrison demanded, his voice hoarse. "Why not years ago?" Father Thomas pulled out Ellen's final letter, sealed for 2 decades. "Because you weren't ready to hear it," he said simply. "Your mother knew you would need to find your own path back to truth. She asked me to wait until you could see with your heart again, not just your hurt." Outside, the snow fell thicker, wrapping Millbrook in white silence. The church's spires caught the glow of streetlights, standing like silent witnesses to the unfolding revelations. In that moment, Harrison remembered Sarah's words about God being present in acts of love, not buildings. He thought of his mother's patient love, Father Thomas's decades-long vigil, and the enduring faith that had sustained him. James Thompson spoke again, describing how the charity center had helped him and Sarah rebuild their lives. His words painted a picture of community and faith that stood in stark contrast to Pinnacle's cold manipulation. "They tried to turn our pain into profit," he said. "But they didn't count on the power of real faith, not in buildings or institutions, but in God's love working through people who care." The 3 men talked through the night, piecing together 2 decades of deception and loss. As dawn approached, Harrison realized he faced a choice. He could continue living behind his walls of cynicism and wealth, or he could tear them down and risk everything to make things right. The answer, he discovered, had been written in his heart long ago, in his mother's gentle lessons about love and faith. The morning after the confrontation, Harrison found himself standing alone in his church, the rising sun casting rainbow shadows through the stained glass windows. The grandeur that had once filled him with prideful satisfaction now felt hollow. Every gleaming surface, every architectural flourish seemed to mock the true purpose of a house of worship. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to fully remember his mother, not just the sanitized version he'd created to fit his narrative of reason triumphing over faith, but the real Ellen Harrison. He recalled her tired smile after long days of cleaning, her hands roughened by work but gentle when holding his. The way she would sit beside him during thunderstorms, teaching him to see beauty rather than fear in nature's power. The memories came flooding back, overwhelming his carefully constructed defenses. He remembered her final days in the hospital, how she had continued to pray not for herself, but for him. "Money can't buy peace, Michael," she had told him. "Only love can do that." He had dismissed her words as medication-induced rambling. Now, standing in his $100 million monument to spite, he finally understood what she had tried to tell him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from Pinnacle's executives, alternating between threats and attempts at reconciliation. They knew he had the evidence to expose them, but they also had enough material to damage him severely. His entire business empire was intertwined with their operations. Doing the right thing would mean risking everything he had built. Sarah's words about God being present in acts of love echoed in his mind. He thought about James Thompson, who had lost everything but chosen faith over bitterness. About Father Thomas, who had kept his promise to Ellen Harrison through decades of patient waiting. About the communities destroyed by his unwitting collaboration with Pinnacle's schemes. In his office later that day, Harrison began to recognize faces in old photographs from the charity center. People he had dismissed as failures or weaklings were revealed as heroes of everyday faith. A janitor who worked double shifts to help strangers pay their rent. A retired teacher who spent her pension buying school supplies for poor children. His own mother, who had managed to love others abundantly despite having so little herself. The crisis reached its peak when Harrison discovered additional documents revealing Pinnacle's next targets. They planned to use his church as a legal precedent to seize dozens of small religious properties across the country. More communities would be torn apart, more lives disrupted, all in the name of profit. His monument to disbelief would become a weapon against the very faith his mother had lived by. As night fell, Harrison found himself driving through Millbrook streets, past the places that had shaped his life. The hospital where his mother had died, now replaced by luxury condominiums. The diner where she had sometimes treated him to dinner when they had extra money, now an upscale boutique. The charity center's demolished building, its absence like a missing tooth in the city smile. He pulled over near his church, watching as homeless individuals settled into doorways for the night people who would have found shelter in the charity center he had destroyed. A young mother hurried past, clutching a child's hand, reminding him of how his own mother had worked so hard to give him a better life. The weight of his choices, his pride, his deliberate blindness to the consequences of his actions pressed down on him like a physical burden. In the depths of his crisis, Harrison realized that his entire life's work had been built on a foundation of misdirected pain. He had succeeded in business but failed in the one thing his mother had truly wanted for him to keep his heart open to love. His wealth, his power, his carefully constructed image as the rational man triumphant over superstition, all of it was as empty as his magnificent church. Reading his mother's letter by lamplight in his office, Harrison finally allowed himself to weep. Ellen's words, preserved for 2 decades, spoke directly to his heart. "My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, you've begun to remember what I tried to teach you. Faith isn't about being right or proving others wrong. It's about letting love guide your choices, even when it costs you everything. That's the only way to build something that truly lasts." The dawn found him still in his office, his decision made. He would risk everything, his reputation, his fortune, his carefully constructed world, to make things right. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in decades he felt his mother's presence guiding him toward truth. If you've been touched by this story of redemption and faith, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue sharing powerful narratives that explore the depths of human connection and spiritual transformation. Join our community of storytellers and believers. Pinnacle Development's response to Harrison's defection was swift and merciless. Within hours of learning his intentions to expose their schemes, they launched a coordinated attack that demonstrated just how powerful and ruthless they truly were. The morning papers carried leaked stories about Harrison's alleged financial irregularities, suggesting that his religious challenge had been a cover for money laundering operations. The Millbrook Gazette, still under Pinnacle's influence, ran a front-page expose linking Harrison to various failed development projects, conveniently omitting their own role in these ventures. Anonymous sources suggested that his recent erratic behavior was due to mental instability, possibly triggered by guilt over his mother's death. The story implied that his entire church-building project had been a manifestation of psychological breakdown. Father Thomas found himself under renewed attack as well. Old allegations of financial mismanagement resurfaced, accompanied by new, more sinister insinuations about his relationship with young parishioners. The elderly priest faced these accusations with characteristic calm, but the strain showed in his increasingly unsteady hands and tired eyes. James Thompson received midnight phone calls warning him to stay silent. His small construction company, finally recovering after years of struggle, suddenly lost contracts and faced surprise safety inspections. Sarah's school received anonymous complaints about her behavior, and social services received false reports about her home situation. Harrison watched his business empire begin to crumble. Longtime clients distanced themselves, citing reputational concerns. Banks called in loans, investment partners withdrew, and regulatory agencies launched surprise audits. His carefully constructed world of wealth and power was being dismantled with surgical precision by the very forces that had helped him build it. The church itself became a battleground. Pinnacle filed lawsuits claiming partial ownership through complex financial agreements Harrison had signed without fully understanding. They sought an injunction to prevent him from using the building for anything other than its intended purpose, a monument to the triumph of wealth over faith. Most painful were the revelations about Ellen Harrison's final days. Pinnacle released documents showing how they had deliberately delayed her insurance payments, making her suffer unnecessarily to fuel her son's bitterness. They presented this as evidence of Harrison's unstable mental state, suggesting his current actions were driven by irrational guilt rather than legitimate concerns. Through it all, Sarah's small figure could be seen walking to school past the embattled church each morning, her head held high despite the whispers and stares. She would often stop to talk with the homeless people who still gathered there, sharing her lunch or simply offering a kind word. Her simple acts of faith and love stood in stark contrast to the corporate warfare raging around her. The personal toll of standing against Pinnacle became increasingly evident in the weeks that followed. Harrison, who had once commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence, found himself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking shadows for surveillance. His once immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious as sleepless nights left their mark. Father Thomas's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress of constant accusations. The elderly priest suffered a minor heart attack after a particularly aggressive reporter ambushed him outside his modest apartment. Though he insisted on continuing his daily rounds to visit the sick and troubled, his steps grew slower, his breathing more labored. The doctors advised rest, but he replied simply, "God's work doesn't wait for convenient times." Sarah's life, once filled with the simple joys of childhood, became complicated by adult concerns. Her classmates, hearing their parents' discussions of the scandal, began to treat her differently. Some avoided her entirely, while others asked painful questions about her father's past. She maintained her characteristic grace, but Harrison noticed how she hugged her schoolbooks tighter to her chest when walking past groups of whispering parents. James Thompson faced the potential collapse of everything he'd rebuilt. His construction company's reputation, painstakingly restored over years of honest work, was being systematically destroyed. Clients withdrew, suppliers demanded cash payments, and his workers faced intimidation. Yet each morning he arrived at his small office, made coffee for his remaining employees, and carried on with quiet dignity. Harrison's closest advisors and friends gradually distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. His executive assistant of 15 years resigned with tears in her eyes, explaining that her daughter's college acceptance had been mysteriously rescinded. Longtime business partners stopped returning calls. Even his doorman, who had worked in his building for decades, was replaced without explanation. The church, meant to be Harrison's crowning achievement, stood increasingly empty. The magnificent pipe organ remained silent, the gleaming pews gathered dust, and the grand entrances were used only by legal teams delivering more papers. The homeless people who had once found shelter in the charity center now huddled in its shadows, their presence a constant reminder of what had been lost. Most painful were the moments when Harrison visited his mother's grave. The once immaculate cemetery plot showed signs of vandalism, small things, easily deniable, but clearly meant to send a message. He hired security to protect the site, but found himself wondering what Ellen would think of armed guards watching over her final resting place. The costs weren't just personal but extended to the entire Millbrook community. The town's social fabric, already strained by the original church controversy, began to tear under the pressure of choosing sides. Long-standing friendships ended over dinner-table arguments. Church congregations split. The sense of small-town trust that had characterized Millbrook for generations eroded in the acid of suspicion and fear. The tide began to turn on a rainy Wednesday morning when an unexpected package arrived at Harrison's office. Inside was a thumb drive and a note that read simply, "Not everyone can be bought the sender. A mid-level Pinnacle executive with a terminal illness had decided to clear his conscience." The drive contained thousands of internal documents detailing 2 decades of systematic corruption. Harrison immediately assembled a small team of trusted lawyers and investigators in a secure location outside Millbrook. Working around the clock, they pieced together a devastating picture of corporate manipulation. The evidence showed how Pinnacle had orchestrated not just the Blessed Hope Foundation scandal, but dozens of similar operations across the country. Every fraudulent scheme, every manipulated property deal, every manufactured controversy had been meticulously documented. The most damning evidence concerned Ellen Harrison's final days. Emails proved that Pinnacle executives had deliberately interfered with her insurance coverage, hoping to push her son toward bitterness and away from faith. They had calculated with chilling precision how her death could be used to create the perfect front man for their property acquisition schemes. Father Thomas's persecution was also revealed as carefully orchestrated. The allegations against him had been fabricated by a network of paid informants. Even the social services reports about Sarah had been part of their strategy, designed to silence James Thompson by threatening his daughter's stability. Harrison took the evidence to Alexandra Martinez, a federal prosecutor known for her integrity and determination. She reviewed the files in stunned silence, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When she finished, she looked up at Harrison with fierce determination. "They didn't just break laws," she said. "They broke lives. We're going to make this right." The investigation moved with surprising speed. Federal agents descended on Pinnacle's offices in multiple cities simultaneously. Computers were seized, executives were interrogated, and the carefully constructed facade of corporate legitimacy began to crumble. The evidence was too comprehensive, too detailed to be denied. As news of the investigation broke, other whistleblowers came forward. Former employees, displaced residents, and defrauded investors all contributed pieces to the puzzle. The pattern of corruption emerged, clearly targeting vulnerable religious and charitable properties, creating artificial crises, then swooping in to save the properties through front companies. Harrison's public testimony before a grand jury lasted 6 hours. He spoke without notes, describing how his genuine grief and anger had been weaponized against others. His voice broke only once when he described finding his mother's diary and realizing how thoroughly her memory had been dishonored by his actions. The evidence not only vindicated Harrison but also cleared James Thompson's name. The original fraud that had destroyed his business was revealed as part of Pinnacle's larger scheme. Father Thomas's reputation was restored, the allegations against him exposed as fabrications. But the truth, so long buried under layers of corporate deception, finally emerged into the light. The path to personal healing began in the quiet of Harrison's church, now transformed from a monument of defiance into a sanctuary of reconciliation. On a crisp autumn morning, Harrison met with James Thompson and Sarah, not as adversaries or symbols, but as people bound together by shared pain and hope. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to hold them in a gentle embrace. Sarah, with the wisdom that had first shaken Harrison's world, bridged the awkward silence. "My grandmother Rachel used to say that forgiveness is God's way of giving us a fresh start," she said, taking both men's hands in hers. Like when the sun comes up every morning, making everything new again, Harrison recognized Ellen's spirit in the child's words, a legacy of faith passed down through unexpected channels. Father Thomas, now recovering from his health crisis, joined them later that day. His first words to Harrison were not of accusation but of understanding. "Your mother never lost faith in you, Michael. She knew that love would find its way back to your heart." The elderly priest shared stories of Ellen Harrison's final days, not the sanitized version Harrison had clung to, but the full truth of her unwavering faith and love. The reconciliation rippled outward through the community. Harrison opened the church doors to the homeless while proper housing solutions were developed. The magnificent pipe organ played again, this time for a memorial service honoring all those who had been hurt by corporate greed masquerading as religious authority. The ceremony brought together people from all faiths and backgrounds, healing old wounds and building new bridges. James Thompson's construction company was awarded the contract to rebuild the charity center, this time integrated with the church in a design that honored both faith and service. Harrison insisted that Sarah and her father maintain oversight of the project, acknowledging that true healing required not just restitution but redistribution of power. Perhaps the most profound moment of reconciliation came when Harrison discovered a box of his mother's belongings in the church's basement. Among photos and letters was a simple cross-stitched message she had made during her illness: "Faith sees best in the dark." As he held it, Sarah appeared beside him, quietly sharing how her own mother had made a similar craft during her pregnancy. The parallel touched something deep in Harrison's heart, a recognition of divine patterns in what he had once dismissed as random tragedy. The transformation of Harrison himself became Millbrook's most talked-about miracle. The man who had built a church to challenge faith found himself attending sunrise prayers with Father Thomas, not from obligation but from a genuine desire to understand the power that had sustained his mother through her hardest days. His questions didn't cease, but they changed from challenges to authentic seeking. The transformation of Harrison's church from a monument of defiance to a beacon of hope unfolded over the following year. The magnificent building, once intended to mock faith, became the centerpiece of a revolutionary community complex that combined worship, charity, and social services. The change began not with grand announcements, but with small, meaningful actions that rippled through Millbrook. The first visible sign of transformation came when Harrison removed his name from the building's facade, replacing it with words from his mother's diary: "Love builds here." The grand entrance hall, once a showcase of opulent materials, was converted into a welcoming space where people from all walks of life could gather. The expensive marble floors now bore the gentle scuff marks of wheelchairs, children's shoes, and well-worn work boots. Under Father Thomas's guidance, Harrison learned to see his wealth not as a weapon to prove points, but as a tool for healing and growth. The church's vast resources were redirected to support programs that embodied Ellen Harrison's vision of faith in action. The commercial kitchen, initially installed to impress donors, now served 3 meals daily to anyone in need. The state-of-the-art classroom spaces hosted job training programs, counseling services, and educational support for underprivileged children. Sarah's influence on the transformation was subtle but profound. Her suggestion to create a children's garden in memory of both their mothers led to a beautiful space where healing and hope could take root. The garden became a symbol of renewal, where elderly volunteers taught young children to nurture plants and faith alike. Harrison often found himself sitting there, watching the interaction between generations, seeing his mother's legacy living on in unexpected ways. The magnificent pipe organ, once intended to showcase human achievement, now filled the space with music that brought comfort and inspiration. Local musicians offered free lessons to children who could never afford them otherwise. The sound of practice sessions mingled with hymns, creating a constant reminder that beauty and faith could coexist with practical service. James Thompson's construction expertise helped modify the building to better serve its new purpose, adding features that made it truly accessible to all. His crew worked alongside volunteers, their shared labor healing old divisions in the community. The renovation process itself became a kind of ministry, with workers and helpers sharing meals and stories as they transformed the space. Most remarkable was Harrison's personal transformation. The man who had once sneered at faith found himself moved to tears by simple acts of kindness he witnessed daily in his transformed church. He still asked questions, still sought to understand, but now from a place of openness rather than defiance. His mother's Bible, once kept locked away, found a home on his desk, its pages gradually acquiring the well-worn look of regular use. 1 year after Sarah's first appearance in his church, Harrison stood at the same podium where he had once challenged God. The occasion was the dedication of the Ellen Harrison Memorial Complex, but this time the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The pews were filled with a true cross-section of Millbrook homeless individuals sat beside business executives, former addicts next to social workers, all bound together by the community that had grown within these walls. Father Thomas, though physically frailer, radiated a quiet joy as he blessed the renovated complex. His voice carried the weight of vindication, not in triumph but in humble gratitude. This place, he said, stands as testimony that God's love can transform even our greatest challenges into opportunities. For Grace Harrison, watching from his seat beside Sarah and James Thompson, felt the truth of those words in his bones. The complex had become more than any of them had initially imagined. The church itself remained a place of worship, but now hosted services for multiple faiths, honoring Ellen Harrison's belief that God's love transcended religious boundaries. The adjacent buildings housed a medical clinic, job training center, and transitional housing facilities. The garden, now in full bloom, had become a place of peaceful reflection for the entire community. Sarah, now 9, had blossomed in her role as unofficial greeter for the complex. She knew every volunteer by name, remembered the stories of regular visitors, and had an uncanny ability to make newcomers feel welcome. Harrison often watched her in amazement, seeing echoes of his mother's gentle spirit in her interactions with others. The connection between their families, once hidden by pain and circumstance, had become a source of strength and inspiration for the entire community. In his closing remarks at the dedication, Harrison finally shared the full story of his journey from defiance to faith. He spoke of his mother's unwavering love, of Sarah's simple wisdom, of Father Thomas's patient guidance, and of James Thompson's example of resilience. His voice caught as he described the moment he realized that his magnificent church had become truly beautiful only when filled with love and service rather than pride and challenge. "I built this church to prove that faith was meaningless," he concluded, "but God used it to prove that love is the greatest force in the universe. My mother knew this. Sarah reminded me, and now I understand that true faith isn't about buildings or declarations. It's about opening our hearts to love, even when it seems impossible." The final transformation came in the form of a foundation established in memory of Ellen Harrison and Rachel Thompson, dedicated to protecting religious and charitable properties from corporate predation. Harrison's business acumen, once used to accumulate wealth, now serve to preserve spaces of faith and service across the country. The Foundation's first act was to restore properties that Pinnacle had acquired through fraud, returning them to their communities with endowments for sustainable operation. As the dedication ceremony ended, someone began to play the pipe organ. The music soared through the space, no longer a demonstration of technical superiority but a song of gratitude and joy. Sarah took Harrison's hand, leading him to the garden where both their mothers were now memorialized. In the fading evening light, surrounded by blooming flowers and the sounds of community, Harrison finally felt complete. His mother's final prayer had been answered. Her son had found his way back to love. Dear valued viewers, thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of faith and redemption. If you've been moved by Michael Harrison's transformation and Sarah's wisdom, please consider subscribing to our channel to support our storytelling team. Share this story with friends and family who might find comfort or inspiration in its message. Hit the like button and share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Would you like to hear the next chapter of Millbrook's story? Let us know if you're interested in a sequel exploring how this newfound faith continues to transform the community. Copyright.